I never thought I'd become the woman he couldn't forget. When Jackson married that blonde socialite, I moved on with my life. Then came the midnight calls, the gifts at my doorstep, and the offer that would change everything. Leave your job. I'll take care of you. Forever. I never expected to become someone's obsession, but that's exactly what happened with Jackson Wright, the man whose net worth had more commas than my phone number. I'm Ava Bennett, and 2 years ago I was just a marketing director, celebrating my latest promotion when our worlds collided. You know that feeling when someone looks at you, and suddenly everyone else in the room fades away? That's what happened the night we met. I was giving a speech at the Metropolitan Children's Charity Gala. My company had donated a significant amount, and as the head of our community outreach program, I was there representing us. I was wearing this deep burgundy dress that hugged my curves perfectly, my locks swept up into an elegant updo, feeling confident and in my element. I didn't notice him at first. Why would I? I was focused on my speech, on making sure our company's contribution was properly acknowledged. But afterward, as I stepped away from the podium, I caught him staring. Not in that entitled way some wealthy men do, like you're an exotic exhibit they're appraising. No, Jackson looked at me like he'd found something he didn't know he was searching for. That was impressive, he said, approaching me with a glass of champagne. Your passion for children's education came through in every word. His voice had this deep, magnetic quality to it. Jackson stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his warm brown skin contrasting against the crisp white shirt, confidence radiating from him like heat. I thanked him, expecting the conversation to end there. Instead, we talked for hours, about our childhoods, mine in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, his in the privileged circles of old money Atlanta, about our dreams, my plans to start my own agency someday, his vision for expanding his tech empire while creating opportunities for underprivileged kids. The connection between us was instant and electric. I've never met anyone who challenges me the way you do, he told me that night before asking for my number. I gave it to him, thinking he might never call. Men like Jackson Wright, 32, self-made tech millionaire, featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30, didn't typically pursue women like me. Women who worked 60-hour weeks to build careers from scratch, who didn't have family connections or trust funds to fall back on. But call he did, the very next day. And that's how it began, this whirlwind romance that would eventually leave both of us shattered, then strangely, impossibly connected, even after everything fell apart. I'm sharing this story not because I'm proud of all the choices I made, but because I know what it's like to love someone who exists between two worlds, to be the woman who fits perfectly into a man's heart, but not into his family's expectations, to be enough and somehow still not enough at the same time. Stay with me as I reveal how I became the woman this powerful man couldn't erase from his heart, even after he placed a ring on another woman's finger. And the impossible choice I eventually had to make when he decided he wanted us both, his respectable marriage and his true love, hidden in the shadows. This isn't just a story about wealth or privilege or forbidden love. It's about knowing your worth when the world, and sometimes even your own heart, tries to convince you to settle for less than you deserve. Our first real date wasn't at some exclusive restaurant with a 3-month waiting list, like you might expect from someone with Jackson's resources. Instead, he picked me up in his car, a surprisingly modest Tesla, and drove us to a small jazz club in a historic part of town. This place reminds me of where I used to hang out before anyone knew my name, he explained as we settled into a corner booth, the sultry notes of a saxophone wrapping around us. That's the thing about Jackson that surprised me from the start. Beneath the wealth and the achievements, there was still this grounded man who remembered what it felt like to have nothing but ambition and determination. He'd built his tech company from his college dorm room, turning a simple app idea into a platform now used by millions. But success hadn't erased the hunger in him, that drive that I recognized because I had it too. "Tell me about the girl who became this formidable woman," he said, leaning forward, genuinely interested in my story. So I told him about growing up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs, about being the first in my family to go to college, about the string of rejections before I finally got my foot in the door at my company. With other men, I'd learned to downplay my ambition, to make my success seem effortless and non-threatening. With Jackson, I didn't have to dim my light. We fell into an easy rhythm after that night. Weekend brunches, where we'd debate business strategies over Belgian waffles, late-night phone calls when he was traveling for work and couldn't sleep without hearing my voice. Quiet evenings at my apartment, Jackson sprawled on my second-hand couch, his expensive watch and phone discarded on my IKEA coffee table as we streamed documentaries and ordered takeout. "You're the most real thing in my life," he told me once, his head resting in my lap as I ran my fingers through his close-cropped hair. "Everyone else wants something from me. You just want me." Of course, I knew from the beginning that we came from different worlds. I saw it in the casual way he'd order the most expensive wine on the menu without checking the price. In how the maitre d's at exclusive restaurants would suddenly find a table when they recognized him. In the ease with which doors opened that had always been firmly closed to me. But differences aside, what we had felt genuine, the way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room. How he'd send me random texts throughout the day, not extravagant declarations, just small observations that made me feel constantly present in his thoughts. The vulnerability in his voice when he admitted his fears of never living up to his own expectations, regardless of his success. 6 months in, Jackson invited me to a gala hosted by his family's foundation. "It's time you meet the rest of the Wrights," he said, a flicker of something, hesitation, concern. Crossing his face so quickly I almost missed it. I spent weeks preparing, finding the perfect dress, practicing small talk about topics I researched extensively, determined to show his family that, despite my background, I belonged in their world. The night of the gala, I stood by Jackson's side as he introduced me to his parents. His father, Richard Wright, barely glanced at my extended hand before turning back to his conversation with the state senator. His mother, Eleanor, assessed me with cool blue eyes, her smile never reaching them as she said, "So you're in marketing, was it? How fascinating." The chill in her voice made the elaborate ballroom suddenly feel cold. I caught the exchanged glances between Jackson's parents, the slight raise of Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Later, I overheard a snippet of conversation as I returned from the ladies' room. "She's certainly beautiful, darling, but surely this is just a phase. You know what's expected of you." Jackson didn't hear it. He was across the room, charming potential investors. But I did. And standing there in my carefully chosen dress, with my practiced small talk and my achievements that suddenly felt small in this world of generational wealth, I felt the first crack form in the foundation of what we were building. A hairline fracture that would eventually break us both. Despite that first chilly reception from Jackson's family, our relationship blossomed in the months that followed. What started as weekend dates evolved into staying at each other's places 4 nights a week. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. My favorite tea found its way into his kitchen cabinet. Little by little, our separate lives became beautifully entangled. "I've never felt at home with someone before," Jackson confessed one night as we lay in bed, the city lights casting soft shadows across his face. "It's always been about performance, showing the right version of myself to the right people. With you, I don't have to perform." The vulnerability in his eyes made my heart ache. For all his success and privilege, Jackson carried a loneliness that mirrored my own. Around the same time, my career took an unexpected turn. After leading a campaign that increased our clients' engagement by 200%, I was offered a director position. younger than anyone who'd held the title before. When I called Jackson with the news, he showed up at my office an hour later with champagne and took me to dinner at the city's most exclusive restaurant. "To the most brilliant woman I know," he toasted, his eyes shining with genuine pride. "They're lucky to have you." That night, as we celebrated my promotion, Jackson first brought up the future. Our future. "I can see it all with you, Ava," he said, fingers intertwined with mine across the table. The home we'd build together, the life we'd share. He didn't formally propose, but the implication hung in the air between us. The possibility of forever. As spring turned to summer, Jackson introduced me to his world more fully. We flew to Martha's Vineyard on his company's private jet, spent weekends at luxury resorts in Bali and the Maldives, attended galas where I mingled with celebrities and tech moguls. I won't lie, there was something intoxicating about that lifestyle, about the ease and comfort of it all. But what mattered more was watching Jackson light up when he showed me places that meant something to him, not just impressive locations designed to dazzle. "This is where I came after I got my first major investment," he said, taking me to a small lighthouse on a remote stretch of coastline. I stood here and promised myself I'd never forget what it took to get there. In those moments, I fell deeper in love, not with the millionaire, but with the man who remembered his journey. Meanwhile, I introduced Jackson to my world. We had Sunday dinners with my mother in her modest 2-bedroom apartment, where he charmed her completely by asking for her secret mac and cheese recipe. We met my college roommates for trivia night at our favorite dive bar, where Jackson, despite his encyclopedic knowledge, deliberately lost to keep things fun. He came to my company's volunteer day at a local youth center, rolling up his sleeves and painting walls alongside my co-workers, who gradually stopped seeing him as Ava's rich boyfriend and started seeing the person I loved. "Your people are good people," he told me afterward. "They care about what matters." The way he said it, "your people," should have been a warning sign, a subtle acknowledgement of the divide that still existed. But I was too in love to notice. 7 months into our relationship, Jackson asked me to move in with him. His penthouse apartment was a minimalist dream, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made the city look like a glittering jewel box. "We can redecorate," he offered, sensing my hesitation. "Make it ours, not just mine." The gesture touched me deeply, this successful man who could have anything wanted to build something with me. But as I integrated more into Jackson's life, the undercurrents of family tension became impossible to ignore. Dinners at his parents' estate were exercises in coded language and veiled disapproval. "Have you considered taking some business courses, Ava?" his mother would ask. "Jackson's future wife will need to understand how to manage certain responsibilities." Or his father commenting, "The Wright family has always aligned with the Caldwells and the Harringtons. Tradition matters in our circles." Jackson would squeeze my hand under the table during these moments, sometimes challenging his parents directly. "Ava's already more business-savvy than half my executive team," he'd counter, but more often, he'd change the subject, avoiding direct confrontation while promising me later, "They'll come around. They just need time." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, because by then, I couldn't imagine my life without Jackson in it. We'd started talking about rings, about ceremony venues, about how many children we might want someday. Our future seemed so close I could almost touch it. What I didn't realize was that while I was planning our forever, Jackson's family was orchestrating their own version of his future, one that had been mapped out long before I entered the picture. And the pressure they were placing on him was building like a storm on the horizon, one that would soon break over both our heads and wash away everything we thought we were building. Looking back, I can pinpoint exactly when everything started to unravel. It was at Jackson's birthday celebration, a lavish affair at his family's country estate that felt more like a networking event than a birthday party. I'd spent weeks finding the perfect gift for him, a vintage watch I'd restored, similar to one his grandfather had owned. When I gave it to him privately before the party, his eyes had welled up with tears. "No one has ever understood me the way you do," he whispered, holding me close. That moment, that perfect, intimate moment, was the last time things felt completely right between us. At the party, I noticed Jackson deep in conversation with his father and another older man I didn't recognize. Their body language was tense, with Jackson repeatedly shaking his head. When he finally rejoined me, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just business," he replied, but I could feel him pulling away, retreating somewhere I couldn't follow. In the weeks that followed, Jackson became increasingly distant. Our nightly calls dwindled to quick check-ins. Weekend plans were cancelled last minute due to emergency meetings. When we were together, he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere, even when his body was next to mine. I tried everything, planned surprise dates to our favorite spots, left little notes in his jacket pockets, created space for him to talk when he was ready. But the wall between us only grew higher. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd stopped by his penthouse unannounced, worried after not hearing from him for 2 days. I found him sitting in the dark, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the city lights. "My father had a heart attack," he said without turning around. "Minor one. He's fine, but it was a warning sign." His voice sounded hollow, detached. He made me promise something while I was sitting by his hospital bed. My stomach twisted with dread. "What did you promise, Jackson?" "That I'd start taking the family legacy seriously." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes clouded with conflict. "The right name comes with responsibilities, Ava. Connections that span generations. Business alliances that need to be maintained." "What are you saying?" I asked, though somewhere deep inside I already knew. "My parents have made it clear. If I want to maintain my position as heir to the right holdings, not just my company, but everything, certain expectations must be met." He took a deep breath. "They've introduced me to Catherine Harrington. Her father's firm has been linked with ours for decades." The words hit me like physical blows. "You're choosing your inheritance over us, over what we have?" "It's not that simple," he insisted, running his hands over his face. "Without my family's backing, my company could lose critical investors. Hundreds of people could lose their jobs. Everything I've built could crumble. So I'm just collateral damage in your business plan." My voice shook with anger and pain. "I love you, Ava. I've never loved anyone the way I love you." His voice cracked. "But love isn't always enough in my world." We talked in circles for hours, argued, cried, held each other. But by morning, the reality was unavoidable. Jackson had made his choice. "Maybe in a few years, when my position is more secure," he suggested weakly. "Don't." I cut him off, gathering my dignity around me like armor. "Don't offer me your some days. I deserve someone who chooses me today." As I walked out of his penthouse that morning, I felt like I was leaving part of myself behind. The part that had believed fairy tales could come true. The part that had thought love could bridge any divide. The naive part that hadn't understood that in certain worlds, people like me would always be temporary. Beautiful diversions before returning to the predetermined path. The days that followed passed in a blur of grief. Jackson called repeatedly, sent messages apologizing, explaining, asking for understanding. Eventually, I blocked his number, needing the contact to stop so I could begin to heal. I threw myself into work, taking on projects that required every ounce of my focus and creativity. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my relationship. I redecorated my apartment, erasing the visual reminders of the life I'd imagined with him. Externally, I projected strength and resilience. Internally, I was relearning how to exist as just myself again. The hardest part wasn't losing the luxury or the lifestyle. I'd lived without those things before and could do so again. The hardest part was the phantom pain of missing someone who still existed in the world, but was no longer part of mine. "You'll find someone who deserves you," my best friend Tasha assured me, over wine and ice cream. "I don't want to find anyone," I replied truthfully. "I want to find myself first." And slowly, painfully, I did just that. I remembered the woman I'd been before Jackson, ambitious, self-sufficient, with dreams of my own that had nothing to do with being someone's wife. I reconnected with that version of myself and found she was still there, wounded but unbroken. 3 months after our breakup, I was offered a position to lead a new division at my company. The day I accepted, I finally deleted the photos of Jackson from my phone and told myself it was time to move forward. I truly believed the chapter of my life that included Jackson Wright had closed for good. I had no idea that fate, or perhaps Jackson himself, had other plans, and that the ending of our story was still waiting to be written. I wish I could say I was completely over Jackson when the news broke, but that would be a lie. 6 months after our breakup, I was scrolling through my phone during my morning coffee when I saw it. A business newsletter announcement about the engagement of tech mogul Jackson Wright to socialite Catherine Harrington, uniting two of the city's most prestigious families. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering on my kitchen floor. I stared at the photo, Jackson in a tailored suit, his arm around a willowy blonde, whose diamond ring caught the light like a small planet. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Or maybe that's just what I needed to believe. "Are you okay?" my assistant asked when I arrived at work that morning, my eyes still puffy despite my best efforts with concealer. "Just allergies," I lied, throwing myself into back-to-back meetings so I wouldn't have time to think. But thoughts of Jackson invaded anyway. Had he ever really loved me? Was I just a rebellion before he inevitably returned to his predetermined path? The questions haunted me, making me doubt not just him, but myself, my judgment, my worth, my ability to recognize genuine love. "You need to block the wedding date on your calendar," Tasha insisted over lunch. "We're taking you to the wine country that weekend. No phones, no internet, no way to torture yourself with the details." She was right, of course, but I didn't need to set a calendar reminder. The date was already branded into my consciousness. July 15th, the day Jackson would legally bind himself to someone else. Meanwhile, life didn't pause for my heartbreak. My new division at work was thriving under my leadership. I'd been featured in a 40 under 40 list in a major business publication. I bought my first condo, a modest but beautiful space that was entirely mine. Piece by piece, I was building a life I could be proud of, separate from the shadow of what might have been with Jackson. I even went on a few dates. Nothing serious, just coffee or dinner with men my friends thought I might connect with. Each time, I found myself mentally comparing them to Jackson, then hating myself for doing so. "It takes time," my therapist assured me. "Be patient with your heart. It's healing at its own pace." 3 weeks before the wedding, a package arrived at my office. No return address, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a first edition of my favorite novel, the one I'd mentioned to Jackson on our third date when we'd stayed up all night talking about books that had changed us. There was no note, but I knew. My hands trembled as I placed the book in my desk drawer, unable to throw it away but unwilling to take it home. The night before the wedding, against all better judgment, I found myself Googling details. The ceremony would be at the Wright family's estate. 600 guests were expected. The bride would wear a designer gown, rumored to cost more than my annual salary. The honeymoon would be a month-long tour of private islands and exclusive resorts. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. He made his choice, I told myself firmly. Now make yours, choose to let go. The day of the wedding, I did go to wine country, not with friends as planned, but alone. I checked into a small boutique hotel, turned off my phone, and spent the day hiking through vineyards. With each step, I tried to release the what-ifs, the might-have-beens. By sunset, sitting on a terrace overlooking rows of grapevines bathed in golden light, I felt something shift inside me, not complete healing, but the beginning of acceptance. When I returned to the city and finally turned my phone back on, the notifications flooded in. Photos of the wedding dominated social media and news sites. I braced myself and looked, just once, I promised myself, just to make it real. There was Jackson, handsome in his tuxedo, a champagne glass raised in a toast. There was Catherine, undeniably beautiful in her elaborate gown. There were the Wrights and Harringtons, radiating satisfaction at this perfect merger of bloodlines and bank accounts. It was exactly the fairy tale wedding I'd expected, orchestrated, photographed, and publicized to perfection. What I didn't expect was the hollow feeling the images left me with. This lavish spectacle seemed so far removed from the Jackson I'd known, the man who'd been most animated discussing tech innovations that could help underprivileged communities, who'd preferred takeout and documentaries to galas and champagne. He looks like he's playing a role, I murmured to myself, before closing the browser and promising myself it would be the last time I sought out news of Jackson Wright. Life moved forward. Fall turned to winter. I was promoted again, now leading a team of 30. I finally finished decorating my condo, creating a space that felt completely my own. I adopted a rescue cat named Milo, who became my favorite companion on quiet evenings. I even met a man named Daniel, a thoughtful architect with kind eyes who never made me feel like I needed to be anything other than exactly who I was. I thought I was finally free of Jackson's orbit, that the gravitational pull he'd once exerted on my heart had weakened enough for me to escape it entirely. Then came the night, 3 months after his wedding, when my doorman called up. "Miss Bennett, there's a package for you." I went downstairs, expecting the books I'd ordered online. Instead, I found a small velvet box with no card, no note. Inside was a delicate bracelet, not flashy or obviously expensive, but vintage and unique, exactly my taste. Exactly the kind of thing the Jackson I'd known would choose. My hand shook as I closed the box, my heart racing with anger and confusion. What right did he have to reach into my carefully reconstructed life, to remind me of what I'd lost, what he'd chosen to walk away from? I didn't know then that this small, unsettling gift was just the beginning. That despite his vows, despite his marriage, despite everything, Jackson Wright wasn't done with me yet, not by a long shot. I wish I could say I returned the bracelet, that I packaged it up with a firmly worded note about respecting boundaries. Instead, I tucked it away in my jewelry box and tried to forget about it. One moment of weakness, I told myself. An impulse on his part that wouldn't be repeated. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, a delivery of my favorite flowers, purple dahlias, arrived at my office with no card. The week after that, a rare vinyl record by an obscure jazz artist I'd once mentioned loving. Each gift perfectly chosen, each one a needle straight to the heart, reminding me how well he'd known me. How well he still did. "You need to tell him to stop," Tasha insisted when I finally confessed about the gifts. "This isn't fair to you." She was right, but I had no way to contact him. I'd blocked his number months ago, deleted his email from my contacts, and part of me, a small, shameful part, was curious about where this was leading. I got my answer on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was working late, the office nearly empty, when my assistant buzzed through. "There's a Mr. Wright here to see you." My heart stopped. "Tell him I'm busy." "He says he'll wait, all night if necessary." I sat frozen at my desk, 1,000 emotions crashing through me. Anger, curiosity, lingering desire, righteous indignation. After 10 minutes of internal debate, I smoothed my hair, straightened my shoulders, and walked to the reception area. And there he was, Jackson Wright, looking simultaneously exactly the same and completely different. Same tall frame, same warm brown skin, same perfectly tailored suit. But there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of strain. Ava. Just my name, spoken like a prayer. Whatever this is, it needs to stop, I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. The gifts, the gestures, you're married, Jackson. Can we talk somewhere private? He asked, his eyes darting to my curious assistant. Against my better judgment, I led him back to my office and closed the door. We stood facing each other, the desk between us like a necessary barrier. You look amazing, he said softly. The promotion suits you. How did you know about my promotion? I've kept tabs on you. He didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. I know about the condo too, the feature in Business Quarterly, everything. That's creepy, not romantic, I said, crossing my arms. What do you want, Jackson? He sank into the chair across from my desk, suddenly looking exhausted. I made a mistake, Ava, the biggest mistake of my life. Which part? I kept my voice cold. Breaking my heart or marrying someone you don't love? Both. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with painful honesty. Every day with her feels like a performance. Every night I lie awake thinking about you. What you're doing. If you're happy. If you ever think about me. Stop. I held up my hand. You don't get to do this. You made your choice. A choice I regret every second. He leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. My marriage is a business arrangement. Catherine knows it. Her parents know it. My parents know it. We're living separate lives already, just maintaining appearances. I laughed bitterly. And what? You thought you'd waltz back in and I'd be waiting. Your backup plan if your perfect society marriage didn't fulfill you emotionally. You were never my backup plan, he insisted. You were the detour I wasn't brave enough to commit to. We talked for hours, about his life now, the emptiness of his marriage, the increasing pressure from both families to produce an heir, his growing resistance to his parents' influence over his company, about my life, my successes at work, my new home, my careful journey toward healing. As midnight approached, he finally came to his point. I want to take care of you, Ava. I want to give you everything. I don't need your money, I said, confused. Not just money, security, freedom, a life where you don't have to work 60-hour weeks, where you can pursue whatever makes you happy. His eyes were fever-bright with intensity. I've set up a trust, completely separate from my family's finances. No one can touch it but you. Realization dawned slowly, horror creeping up my spine. Are you proposing to make me your mistress? He flinched at the word. I'm proposing to give you the life you deserve while I figure out how to extricate myself from this marriage without losing everything I've built. How generous, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm to mask my pain. And what happens when you've extricated yourself? When you're free? What's the plan then, Jackson? He reached across the desk, trying to take my hand. I pulled back. Then we can be together properly. Build the life we were meant to have. And in the meantime, I'm supposed to what? Wait in a gilded cage? Accept your visits when your schedule allows? Watch from the shadows while you play husband at public events? Each question felt like glass in my throat. It wouldn't be forever, he promised. A year, maybe 2. Get out. My voice was quiet but firm. Ava, please. Get out. I was standing now, trembling with rage. You think because you're rich, because you're a right, you can buy anything. Even me, even my self-respect. That's not what this is, he insisted, rising to his feet. I love you. I never stopped. If you loved me, I said, each word deliberate, you would never ask me to be less than I am, to hide, to accept crumbs of your time while someone else wears your ring. He left, but not before placing a business card on my desk. This has my private number, the one only 3 people in the world have. If you change your mind. I let the card sit there, untouched, as I gathered my things to leave. Only in the elevator did I allow the tears to come, hot and fast, a release of anger and hurt and lingering love. Because the most painful truth, for one brief, shameful moment, I'd considered what it would be like to have him back in my life, even on those degrading terms. The realization terrified me more than his proposal had. How much of myself was I willing to compromise for this man? And if I accepted, what would be left of the woman I'd worked so hard to become? I'd like to say I threw Jackson's card away the moment I got home, that I was strong enough to immediately reject the possibility of having him back in my life, even on his tainted terms. But the truth is messier, more human. I placed that card in my bedside drawer, telling myself I was just preventing a moment of weakness, but knowing deep down I was keeping my options open. For days, I moved through my life like a sleepwalker. I smiled in meetings, made decisions, even laughed at jokes, but underneath it all ran a current of chaos. At night, alone in my condo, I'd take out that card and stare at the number, my finger hovering over my phone screen. "You can't seriously be considering this," Tasha said when I finally confessed everything over wine at her place. The disappointment in her eyes made me flinch. "I'm not," I insisted. But what? But you still love him. But the money would be nice. But you miss the sex." Her voice softened. "Ava, what happened to the woman who told me she deserved someone who would choose her first, not as an afterthought?" Her words stung because they were true. I had said that. I had believed it. And somewhere beneath the confusion and lingering feelings, I still did. "I need to talk to someone who will understand the complexity," I told her. That someone turned out to be my mother. I drove to her apartment the next day, sat at her kitchen table, and poured out the whole sordid story. She listened without interrupting, her hands busy kneading dough for the sweet potato pie she was making. "He's offering you a beautiful cage," she said finally, wiping flour from her hands. "And baby, no cage is worth living in, no matter how pretty the bars." "But what if he does leave her eventually?" I asked, hating how pathetic I sounded. "What if this is just temporary, and we end up together like we planned?" My mother's eyes grew distant. "Your father made me promises too, said he'd leave his wife someday. I waited 4 years for a someday that never came." She took my hands in hers. "Don't make my mistake. Don't put your life on hold for a man who's already shown you where you rank in his priorities." I left her apartment with a clearer mind and a slice of pie I was too nauseous to eat. The next morning, I took Jackson's card out of my drawer, intending to finally throw it away. Instead, I found myself calling the number. "Ava." His voice instantly alert despite the early hour. "You called." "Not for the reason you think," I said quickly. "I need closure. A clean end. I can't do that over the phone." We agreed to meet at a small park near my condo, neutral territory, public enough to keep things appropriate but private enough for an honest conversation. He was waiting when I arrived, casually dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of his usual business attire. The sight of him like this, more like the Jackson I'd fallen in love with than the polished executive, made my heart twist painfully. "Thank you for coming," he said, falling into step beside me as we walked along a tree-lined path. "I need you to understand something," I began, focusing on the path ahead rather than his face. "What you're offering isn't love, it's ownership. It's asking me to make myself smaller, to hide away, to accept less than I deserve." "That's not how I see it," he countered. "I'm trying to give you everything while I figure out the rest. Everything except the one thing that matters, your full commitment, your public acknowledgement, your honest presence in my life." I stopped walking, turning to face him. "Do you know what that would do to me? To be the secret woman? To wonder every time your phone rings if it's your wife? To watch you leave my bed to go home to hers?" Pain flashed across his face. "It wouldn't be like that. Catherine and I barely speak, let alone—" "It doesn't matter," I cut him off. "Whether you sleep with her or not, she's the woman you chose. The woman who has your name, your ring, your public life. And now you want me to accept the leftover parts of you." We argued in circles as we walked, the same points made in different ways. His desire for me warring with his fear of losing everything. My love for him fighting against my sense of self-worth. Neither of us willing to give ground, both of us hurting. Just think about it, he pleaded as our conversation wound down. The trust is already set up, the apartment is already purchased, it's all waiting for you. I stared at him, suddenly seeing with perfect clarity. You did all that before even talking to me. You assumed I'd say yes. The flash of guilt in his eyes told me everything. He had assumed, because women had always said yes to Jackson Wright, because his money had always solved his problems, because he genuinely couldn't conceive of someone choosing dignity over comfort, principles over luxury. I was about to deliver a final cutting rejection when fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Jackson, is that you? The voice came from behind us, female, cultured, with a hint of surprise. We both turned to see a slender blonde woman in expensive athleisure wear, a small dog on a designer leash at her feet. Catherine Harrington Wright. My stomach dropped as recognition dawned in her eyes, not of me specifically, but of what I must represent. Another woman, a clandestine meeting. Her husband's wandering attention. What happened next stunned me. She smiled. Not a real smile, a social smile, practiced and perfect. I thought you were in meetings all morning. Her eyes slid to me, assessing rather than accusatory. I don't believe we've been introduced. Jackson stammered through an introduction, calling me a former colleague with whom he was discussing a potential business opportunity. The lies rolled off his tongue with practiced ease that made me wonder how often he'd done this before. Catherine's handshake was cool and firm. Lovely to meet you, Ava. I've heard Jackson's company has quite an impressive marketing department. Her gaze lingered on my face a moment too long, communicating something I couldn't quite decipher. Knowledge, warning, solidarity. After a few minutes of the most excruciatingly polite small talk imaginable, she excused herself. Don't forget, dinner with the Caldwells tonight, 8 o'clock. She touched Jackson's arm lightly, performatively. Nice meeting you, Ava. As she walked away, the reality of what I'd almost agreed to hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a movie. There was no simple villain here. Catherine was a real person, navigating her own version of a compromised life. If I took Jackson's offer, I wouldn't just be betraying myself. I'd be participating in the betrayal of another woman. Ava, Jackson started. I can't do this, I said, the words rushing out with absolute certainty. Not just because I deserve better, but because we all do. You, me, even her. We all deserve better than this twisted arrangement you're trying to create. She knows the score, he insisted. Our marriage was never about love. That doesn't make it right, I countered, and it doesn't make what you're proposing to me right either. As I walked away from Jackson that day, I felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and liberation. The fantasy I'd been nurturing, that somehow, someday, we'd find our way back to each other, was finally dying, and in its death, I was finding room to truly breathe again. Later that night, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. I know who you are to him, who you were. If you ever want to talk woman to woman, I'm here. We might have more in common than you think. Catherine. I stared at the message for a long time, marveling at the unexpected complexity of a woman I'd reduced to a simple obstacle in my mind. I didn't respond that night, unsure if I ever would, but the message cemented my decision. I wasn't going to be the other woman in Jackson's life, not because I didn't still love him, but because loving him wasn't enough reason to compromise everything else I valued about myself. 3 days after meeting Catherine in the park, I called Jackson. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't waver. I had found my certainty. I need to see you, I said when he answered on the first ring. One last time. We met at a small cafe downtown, busy enough that we couldn't cause a scene, quiet enough for an honest conversation. He arrived looking haggard, hope and fear battling in his eyes. "I've thought about everything," I began, my voice steady, "and I need you to hear me clearly. I will not be your mistress. Not now. Not ever." He started to speak, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. What you're offering isn't love, Jackson. It's a transaction. And I won't sell pieces of myself, my integrity, my self-respect, my future, for any price." "I never meant to insult you," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm trying to find a way for us to be together while I untangle myself from my family's expectations." "That's the problem," I replied. "You're still letting them dictate your life. You're still choosing their approval over your own happiness. And now you want me to wait in the shadows while you find your courage." "What if I leave her now?" he asked suddenly. "Today. What if I walk away from everything? The inheritance, the family connections, all of it. Would you take me back then?" For one breathless moment I imagined it, Jackson choosing me openly, walking away from his golden handcuffs, the two of us building something real together. But the fantasy dissolved as quickly as it formed. "It wouldn't work," I said softly, "because it wouldn't be about us anymore. It would be about what you gave up for me. Every argument, every struggle, every setback. You'd remember what you sacrificed. Eventually, you'd resent me for it." "You don't know that," he insisted. "I do," I countered, "because I know you, Jackson. Better, I think, than you know yourself." I reached across the table, briefly touching his hand, the first and last time I would allow myself to touch him again. "You need to figure out what you want from your life, not what your parents want, not what Catherine wants, not even what I want, what you want." Tears filled his eyes, the first time I'd ever seen Jackson cry. "I want you," he whispered. "No," I said gently. "You want the idea of me, the freedom I represent, the life you imagine we could have, but you don't want it enough to risk everything for it. And that's okay. It just means we're not meant to be." We talked for another hour, about the good memories we'd shared, about the paths our lives had taken, about the lessons we'd learned from loving each other. There was sadness, but also a strange peace, the closure I'd been seeking for so long. As we prepared to part ways, Jackson asked, "Can I contact you?" "As a friend?" I shook my head. "Number, we both need a clean break. A real ending." Walking away from that cafe, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of possibility, of what if, and maybe someday, had finally lifted. I had chosen myself, my worth, my future, and in doing so, I had set us both free. 2 weeks later, I received a small package. Inside was the bracelet he'd sent months before, along with a note. "You were right. About everything. I'm figuring out what I want. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Be happy, Ava." I donated the bracelet to a charity auction. Its beauty deserved to bring joy to someone else, someone without the complicated history it held for me. Life moved forward, as it always does. I threw myself into growing my division at work, mentoring young women starting their careers, volunteering at the community center where my mother taught cooking classes. I traveled, not to luxury resorts, but to places that fed my soul. The hills of Tuscany, the bustling markets of Morocco, the serene temples of Japan. I occasionally heard news of Jackson through industry circles. His company was expanding into sustainable technology. He'd started a foundation providing tech education for underserved communities. According to rumor, he and Catherine maintained their marriage but lived increasingly separate lives, a society arrangement that seemed to suit them both. I didn't follow these updates closely. They were simply facts, no more relevant to my daily life than the weather in a distant city. The emotional tether that had once bound me to Jackson's orbit had finally, mercifully, snapped. Then, 18 months after our final conversation, I met Michael. Not at a glamorous gala or exclusive event, but in the community garden where I volunteered on weekends. He was a pediatric surgeon with gentle hands and laugh lines around his eyes, there with his 9-year-old daughter who was working on a school science project. Our connection wasn't the immediate lightning strike I'd felt with Jackson. It was quieter, steadier, a slow-building warmth that felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before, but somehow recognized. He listened when I spoke. He showed up when he said he would. He integrated me into his life openly, proudly introducing me to his colleagues, his friends, his daughter. "I would never ask you to be less than who you are," he told me 6 months into our relationship. "Your ambition, your independence, they're not obstacles to work around. They're part of why I love you." When he proposed a year later, there were no family dynasties to consider, no inheritance at stake. Just two people who had found something real and wanted to build a life around it. I said yes without hesitation. The week before our wedding, a small package arrived at my office. A rare first edition book, similar to the one Jackson had sent years before, but different. No note this time. None needed. I understood the message. Congratulations, good wishes, a final goodbye. I donated that book too, to the children's hospital where Michael worked. The past it represented no longer had power over me. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my life through loving and losing Jackson Wright. That no relationship is worth the sacrifice of your self-respect, your dignity, your core values. Sometimes people ask if I regret not taking Jackson's offer, if I ever wonder about the luxury, the comfort, the passion I could have had. I tell them the truth, that I gained something far more valuable by walking away. I gained myself, my integrity, my ability to look in the mirror each morning and respect the woman looking back at me. And that, more than any mansion or trust fund or consuming love affair, is the true wealth I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. If you've ever stood at a similar crossroads, tempted to accept less than you deserve because you fear you might never find what you truly want, remember this: the temporary pain of walking away is nothing compared to the permanent cost of staying. Choose yourself. Choose your worth. The right person won't make you choose between love and dignity. They'll offer you both, freely and without condition. That's not just a happy ending. That's a happy beginning. And it's what every single one of us deserves. Looking back at my journey with Jackson, I realize now that what seemed like the most painful experience of my life was actually the most transformative. When he broke my heart, he inadvertently set me on a path to discovering my own worth. And when he returned, offering me a fraction of what I deserved, he gave me the opportunity to claim that worth out loud, not just to him, but to myself. Some might call my story a cautionary tale about dating across social divides. Others might see it as proof that money and privilege corrupt even genuine connections. But I see it differently. To me, this was never about rich versus poor, or privileged versus working class. It was about having the courage to demand what you deserve in love and in life. The hardest truth I had to accept was that sometimes love isn't enough. Jackson did love me, as much as he was capable of loving anyone. But his love came with conditions, with limitations, with the expectation that I would accommodate his world rather than him making space for me in it equally. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't request that you wait in the shadows while someone else stands in the light. It doesn't offer you material comfort as a substitute for respect and dignity. I want you to understand something crucial. Walking away from Jackson was the most difficult decision I've ever made, but staying would have required a far greater sacrifice. The slow erosion of my self-respect, my independence, my very identity. No relationship is worth that price. Not even one that feels like the great love of your life. The months after my final conversation with Jackson were challenging. There were nights I questioned my decision, days I wondered if I'd ever feel that intensity with anyone again. But gradually, I rebuilt myself, stronger, clearer, more certain of what I needed and what I could offer. And when I met Michael, I recognized what healthy love looks like, not because it came with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but because it came with consistency, with mutual respect, with room for both of us to grow independently and together. Our love isn't a fairy tale, it's something better. It's real, sustainable, and nourishing to both our souls. The wealthiest moment of my life wasn't when Jackson offered me financial security. It was when I looked in the mirror the day after refusing his offer and realized I was finally free. From the fantasy of what might have been, from the grip of a love that asked too much and gave too little, from the belief that I needed someone else's validation to be complete. If you're watching this and recognizing elements of your own story, if you're caught between what your heart wants and what your dignity demands, please hear me. Choose yourself, every time, without exception, because anyone who truly loves you would never ask you to choose between their love and your self-respect. Your worth isn't determined by who loves you or how much they're willing to sacrifice to be with you. Your worth is inherent, unchangeable, and non-negotiable. And the right person won't just recognize that worth. They'll add to it, nurture it, celebrate it. I'm not telling you to be cynical about love or to protect your heart so fiercely that no one can reach it. I'm asking you to love yourself enough to set boundaries, to expect reciprocity, to walk away when someone offers you less than you deserve, no matter how beautiful the cage they've built for you. My story isn't special. There are countless women and men who have stood where I stood, torn between longing and dignity. If you're one of them, I hope my journey gives you the courage to choose the harder path that leads to genuine happiness rather than the easier one that leads to gilded compromise. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of women who refused to settle, who found the strength to demand better, who built lives defined by their own choices rather than someone else's limitations. Follow me on social media to join a community that celebrates self-worth and authentic connections. Remember, true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or trust funds. It's measured in your ability to look at yourself with pride, to surround yourself with people who value all of you, to build a life that feels honest and aligned with your deepest values. The Black woman Jackson couldn't let go. She finally let go of him, and in doing so, she found herself, the most precious discovery of all.